Hello, I'm R.A. Spratt. I write and perform this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, I'm a children's author, so you can buy a book by me, or you can buy me a coffee by going to buymeacoffee.com/storiesrasprat. It's an easy way to make a small thank you gift to the show so I can keep kicking this can down the road. The podcast directory you're using right now should have a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the show notes, or you can type it into your browser. That's buymeacoffee.com/storiesrasprat. All contributions are gratefully appreciated. Hello and welcome to Bedtime Stories with me, R.A. Spratt. All right, well, it's been another wonderful week. We're having gorgeous weather here in the Southern Highlands. The trees are all turning, even in my own garden, and we've got the Japanese maples going red and the liquid ambers starting to go yellow and orange. It's all looking very, very beautiful. Last week we had the big live show at the State Library of New South Wales, and the kids in the audience had lots of ideas for stories I could do in coming weeks. And one of them, which has been requested before, was the story of Bigfoot. And I thought, oh yeah, I could do that. I'd make a bit of a change from all the Greek myths and the Norse myths. I thought that'd be a bit of fun. And it just so happens that my husband, who is also a writer, and he's currently working as a researcher for a historian, the history book he's working on is a book about Mount Everest and the race to get to the top of Mount Everest, or the endeavours to get to the top of Mount Everest, which is actually, well, according to my husband, and of course I assume he's right because he's done the research, that was where the legend of Bigfoot, the Abominable Snowman, came from originally. I'd never want to let too much reality intrude on my stories, so I took that idea and I took a few other ideas and I wrote the story that I'm going to do today, which is The Legend of Bigfoot, as told by Nanny Piggins. Here we go. When Derek, Samantha and Michael brought Boris home, he was weeping very loudly. "What's happened?" asked Nanny Piggins. "Did they run out of honey at the supermarket again?" "No, in fact, the supermarket manager has made an arrangement with the petrol station to use one of their underground storage vats that can hold 10,000 litres of honey at once, so Boris should be okay until the end of the week," said Michael. "Then what's all the weeping about?" asked Nanny Piggins. "Oh, someone said something mean to Boris," said Samantha. Nanny Piggins was shocked. "Not a ballet critic. One of the best things about living in Dulsford is how few ballet critics live in this area." "No," said Derek. "It was a kindy kid at school. Boris was waiting for us by the school gate, and the little boy had never seen a 10-foot-tall bear before. He thought Boris was—" Derek looked at Boris. He didn't want to say the word out loud because he didn't want to make Boris cry harder. He thought Boris was Bigfoot. As predicted, Boris wailed. "Bigfoot?" asked Nanny Piggins. "Are you sure you didn't mishear and he was actually saying beetroot?" "No, he was definitely saying Bigfoot," said Samantha. "The little boy started screaming it over and over again. 'Bigfoot! Bigfoot! We're being attacked by Bigfoot! We're all going to die!'" "And that set Boris off," said Derek. Boris never liked it when people made comments about his size. "What an unpleasant little boy," said Nanny Piggins. "Boris, would you like me to go down to the school and stomp on the child's foot?" But Boris couldn't hear her. He was still too busy weeping loudly. "To be fair," said Samantha, "I don't think the boy had ever seen a bear before, and he wasn't expecting to meet one at the school gate. And Boris's crying was very loud, so I can see how the boy might have mistaken it for some kind of attack." "But it's such a ridiculous concern," said Nanny Piggins. "Bigfoot is perfectly lovely. If Bigfoot did visit your school, there would be no need to worry." "Are you saying you know Bigfoot?" asked Derek. "Of course," said Nanny Piggins. "In fact, as it happens, Bigfoot is actually a distant relative of mine. Her full name was Nisha Bigfoot Piggins." "So you're saying that Bigfoot was a woman?" asked Derek. "And a pig?" asked Samantha. "Indeed," said Nanny Piggins. "After all, Bigfoot was a creature so magnificent that after only a couple of brief glimpses, she's completely captured the public's imagination, and people have been talking about her for the last 100 years. You didn't think a human was capable of that level of spectacularness, did you?" No, said Derek, but we didn't think Bigfoot was a human either. We thought it was an imaginary monster. Oh no, she's definitely not imaginary, said Nanny Piggins. She's very real. In fact, my cousin Nisha, aka Bigfoot, Piggins, still sends me Christmas cards every year. She's still alive, said Michael. Of course, said Nanny Piggins. All that alpine air is very good for the constitution. You're going to have to tell us the whole story, said Derek. All right, said Nanny Piggins, but we'd better eat something Tibetan to set the right atmosphere. I know, kapsi. What, said Michael? Kapsi, said Nanny Piggins. It's an ear-shaped, deep-fried Tibetan sweet biscuit covered in powdered sugar. Yum, said Michael. Absolutely, said Nanny Piggins. So Nanny Piggins whipped up a batch of kapsi, and the children started munching the delicious fried biscuits as she began her tale. As I say, it all began 100 years ago towards the end of the British Empire days, said Nanny Piggins. The Empire days, said Derek. Yes, said Nanny Piggins. As your teachers have probably mentioned in history lessons, the British used to have an empire. They really liked controlling lots of countries. But about 100 years ago, the empire was becoming less empire-ish, and many of the countries were becoming more independent-ish. This made the British very sad, and they did lots of adventurous things to cheer themselves up, like try to be the first country to get to the North Pole. Sadly, the Norwegians beat them to it. Or to try to be the first country to get to the South Pole. Sadly, the Norwegians beat them to that too. So then the British had another idea. They would be the first country to climb the highest mountain in the entire world, Mount Everest. So, in 1924, a team of 12 British mountaineers set out. Now, the actual climbing part was obviously going to be hard, but that wasn't the only hard bit. It was hard even getting to the base of Mount Everest in the first place. You see, Mount Everest sits right on the border of Nepal and Tibet, and the Nepal side is the easiest side to get up. But in 1924, no foreigner was allowed into the country of Nepal. Why not? Asked Michael. I'm not sure, said Nanny Piggins. I think they just didn't like having any visitors. So instead, the British team had to travel through India to get to Tibet, then ask the Dalai Lama for permission to climb Mount Everest. Wait, the Dalai Lama was alive 100 years ago too? Asked Derek. Well, yes and no, said Nanny Piggins. The Dalai Lama 100 years ago was a different man to the Dalai Lama today, so in that way, no. But the Dalai Lama is the reincarnation of the previous Dalai Lama, so in that way, yes. I don't understand, said Michael. Of course you don't, said Nanny Piggins. This is why you should never interrupt a story with questions about facts. Sorry, Nanny Piggins. Please continue, said Derek. He wanted to hear the rest of the tale. So, the Dalai Lama didn't like giving anyone permission to climb Mount Everest because he thought it was cocoa bananas and he didn't want anyone to die. He was very enlightened that way. But the British were insistent and the Dalai Lama reluctantly agreed. Now, you have to understand, Mount Everest sticks a very long way up into the sky, 8,480 metres to be exact, and up there the weather is not very good. It's very windy and very cold, so each year there's only a 2-month period where the weather is right for making an attempt to climb it. And the air is so thin up there, with so little oxygen, you have to keep stopping and spending a few days at each increasing altitude to let your body adjust. So, the team of 12 British mountaineers and the 60 locals they had hired to be their porters and carry all their equipment spent weeks systematically making their way up the mountain. Eventually, they were only a couple of days from reaching the highest campsite when one of the mountaineers, a man called George Mallory, spotted something alarming below. "A ballet critic?" asked Boris. "No, mercifully, nothing that terrible," said Nanny Piggins. "He spotted a footprint in the snow." "Crikey," said Mallory. "What could make a footprint that big?" And this is where they struck a problem. You see, the local porters were local people who came from the Himalayas, and they didn't speak English very well, because television had not been invented and they'd had no opportunity to watch the young and the irritable. "Oh, those poor souls," said Boris. "Well, they did have kapsi," said Nanny Piggins, "so you don't need to feel sorry for them. Those deep-fried biscuits were delicious." But anyway, the British did have a translator, a Tibetan man called Karma Paul, and he had learned English at a school in India. But you know what schools are like. They always focus on silly things like maths and science and writing essays. They rarely focus on important things like how to translate the names of weird regional monsters. Said Karma Paul, struggling to think of the best words to describe this creature in English. In English, you would call this creature Bigfoot. Bigfoot, said Mallory. Yes, said Karma Paul. Bigfoot. Hairy Bigfoot. But this footprint is bigger than an elephant, said Mallory. If this hairy creature has feet that big, it must be enormous. Now, this idea totally terrified the British mountaineers. Really, said Samantha? But surely they were very brave if they were brave enough to try and climb Mount Everest. Said Nanny Piggins. Yes, but sometimes the line between very brave and very silly can become blurred. And to be fair, humans are often totally irrationally frightened of the tiniest animals. Do you remember last week when your father found that huntsman spider behind the visor of his car when he was backing out of the driveway? Of course we remember, said Derek. Yeah, he screamed and smashed into Mrs. Simpson's hedge, said Samantha. Yes, such fun, said Nanny Piggins wistfully. But my point is, Mr. Green is a fully grown man, and yet he was utterly terrified of a creature that is only as big as his hand. Well, that's pretty big for a spider, said Samantha. But if he can be that frightened of something that small, said Nanny Piggins, imagine how frightened he could be of something 10,000 times bigger. 10,000 times more frightened, said Derek, doing the maths in his head. Exactly, said Nanny Piggins. And the poor mountaineers had nothing to do up on that mountain. There was no cinema, no 10-pin bowling, no Wi-Fi. They sat in their tents at night as the wind howled and imagined the huge monster that might be lurking just outside. Oh, I want to go to the bathroom, wailed Boris. Boris, there's no need for you to be frightened, said Nanny Piggins. You're here in the living room. You're not 8 kilometres up Mount Everest in a tent at night. Oh, thank goodness, said Boris. Please don't ever make me go there. I'm sure the people at the top of Mount Everest would love to see me perform ballet, but they'll just have to come down the mountain to do it. So, after weeks of climbing, the British mountaineering team was nearly at the top. They set up a camp, and from there smaller teams would try and climb the last very difficult leg to the summit. The plan was that they would have 3 attempts over several days. The first attempt did not make it. They had to turn back. A couple of days later, there was the second attempt, and they too did not make it. They had to turn back. So now there was only one chance left before they'd run out of time and have to go back to the bottom of the mountain. The last team to try was Mallory and another mountaineer called Irvine. So, on the 5th of July, Mallory and Irvine set out. The air was so thin that no matter how heavily they panted, they could never catch their breath. The snow was so deep it was like wading through water, and the ice was so slippery it was like slipping on a banana peel with every step. Altogether, it was a thoroughly unpleasant experience. And the whole time in the back of Mallory and Irvine's minds was the idea that at any moment Bigfoot, a big, hairy monster, could leap out and attack them. Now, the problem with being afraid of something bad happening is that fear itself makes it more likely to happen. What do you mean? Asked Michael. Well, you know how if you're riding a bicycle and you see a big ditch, once you've seen it, you can't tear your eyes away. Then you get so nervous thinking about how much it would hurt to fall in that ditch that you get the wobbles. And then inevitably, you do actually fall in the ditch. Yes, that's why trapeze artists never look down, said Boris. It's best not to know how far the ground is away. Just let it be a surprise when you hit it. So Mallory and Irvine had been climbing all morning. They were just making their way along a narrow ledge when down below them Mallory noticed a dark, hairy creature moving in the snow. Oh, Bigfoot, he gasped. Ah! Yelped Irvine. And don't judge him too harshly, he was suffering from oxygen starvation at the time. He grabbed Mallory's shoulders as Mallory turned. Mallory lost his balance and fell off the ledge. And Irvine, being a good friend, held on tight and fell with him. They plummeted 30 metres down into a crevasse. Oh no, said Samantha. Don't worry, said Nanny Piggins. Fortunately, there's a lot of snow on Mount Everest, and they landed on a nice big drift. But they were totally winded, and combined with the oxygen starvation, they both blacked out. When Mallory and Irvine woke up, they were surprised to discover that they were still alive, which was a relief, but there was also a creature standing over them, and the creature was like nothing they had ever seen before. Bigfoot? Asked Michael. Yes, but this creature was not a hairy ape or an abominable snowman. She was a pig, wearing a long faux fur coat, faux fur hat and sunglasses. And she had the biggest feet they had ever seen. "You're Bigfoot," said Mallory. "Excuse me," said Bigfoot. "It's rude to comment on the size of a woman's feet. My name is not Bigfoot. It's Nanny Piggins." "Please don't eat us," said Irvine. "Yuck! As if I would," said Nisha. "I'm a vegetarian, thank you very much. Also, from your odour, I strongly suspect that neither of you has taken a shower since you left London." "We must get back to the mountain," said Mallory. "We only have a few hours left to make it to the summit." "You're going to the top?" asked Nisha. "I wouldn't bother. The view is never very good. It's always cloudy up there." "You have been to the summit of Everest?" asked Mallory. "Of course," said Nisha. "There's not a lot to do up here, and I do like yodeling. It's a bit of fun standing on the peak and belting out a full-throated yodelay-hee-hoo. Sometimes I can even start an avalanche." "But avalanches are incredibly dangerous," said Mallory. "I know," said Nisha, "but standing on the summit of Mount Everest is the safest place in the world to be from avalanches, because avalanches don't travel upwards." "Well, we'd better get going," said Mallory. "We don't have time for chit-chat." "Fine, you're the one who dropped into my front yard," said Nisha. "I'm not keeping you." So Mallory and Irvine got to their feet, then immediately fell down again. "Ow!" cried Mallory. "Ouch!" said Irvine, for they had both sprained their ankles. "Both of them," said Samantha. "Well, they had both fallen 30 metres off a ledge," said Nanny Piggins. "It is a little odd that they both had the same injury," said Derek. "The only thing odd about it was that they weren't both dead," said Nanny Piggins. "I don't think we're going to make it to the summit," said Mallory. Nisha snorted, which just shows how incredulous she was, because as a general rule, being pigs, my relatives try to avoid snorting because it's such a cliché. "But if we can't walk," said Irvine, "how are we going to make it back to camp?" They turned and looked at Nisha. Miss Piggins, I don't suppose you'd be so kind as to carry us down to our base camp?" "What? I am a 4-foot-tall pig," said Nisha, "and you two are fully grown men, and this is the most challenging mountain to climb up or down in the world." "That's a no, is it?" asked Mallory. "Yes, that's a no," said Nisha. "Oh gosh," said Irvine, "I suppose that means we're going to die up here in the snow. Mummy was worried this would happen." Nisha relented. "Look, I can't carry you anywhere, but I can drag you into my cave, and you can stay there until your ankle is better." And that is what she did. Once they were inside, it was lovely and warm. Nisha had a fireplace, a stove, a 3-piece lounge suite, a ping-pong table, and 2 spare rooms. "2 spare rooms in a cave?" asked Derek. "Yes, she was very lucky," said Nanny Piggins. "It was a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom cave with a full kitchen, a lounge, dining area, and games room. The property market is so tight. It's hard finding an apartment that good in any city, so she was very lucky to find it on the top of Mount Everest." Once the men had settled on the sofa, Nisha took off her coat and hat. "Good gracious!" exclaimed Mallory. "You are staggeringly beautiful." "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," said Irvine, "and I never thought I'd say that to a pig." "I know," said Nisha. "It's a burden all the women in my family must live with, staggering beauty. And I'm afraid I'm not as resilient as my cousins and aunts. I grew weary of the marriage proposals and the constant drooling from men. That's why I came to live up here. It was the only place I could escape all the admirers." Then Nisha sat down on the sofa and took her feet off. "Ah!" cried Irvine. "Your feet are removable! What sort of strange beast are you?" "These aren't my feet," said Nisha. "They're my shoes." "But they're huge," said Mallory. "Yes, I made them myself," said Nisha, "out of chocolate cake." "Why are you wearing cake on your feet?" asked Mallory. "Duh, to keep my feet warm," said Nisha. "I always pop them on as soon as the cake comes out of the oven. I'm surprised more people don't wear cake-based shoes. Apart from being tremendously comfortable because they mould to the shape of your foot, you can also nibble on them while you're out and about. Would you like to try some?" "That's disgusting," said Mallory. That's delicious," said Irvine. He'd already popped some in his mouth. "I know," agreed Nisha. And so Mallory and Irvine decided to stay with Nisha until their ankles healed. But their ankles never seemed to get better. After they'd been staying with her for 8 or 9 years, Nisha began to get suspicious. Hey, are your ankles still really sprained, or are you just staying here because you like eating the shoes I bake every day?
We don't like eating your shoes, said Mallory. We love it. We love you too, said Irvine. Will you marry me?
No, marry me, pleaded Mallory. Nisha naturally stomped hard on both of their feet, which actually did sprain them again, but Nisha could not be angry at the mountaineers for falling in love with her cake. No one knew better than her just how good it was, and it was nice having people to bake for. And so Mallory and Irvine lived with my cousin Nisha, also known as Bigfoot, happily ever after. Everyone assumed that Mallory and Irvine had lost their lives in some sort of misadventure, but really they had found happiness with Bigfoot, or rather the big chocolate cake shoes my cousin Nisha always wore. The end. Time for bed. So they never made it to the summit? Asked Eric. No, it would be another 32 years before anyone made it to the summit of Mount Everest, when the British did finally come up with a successful strategy. Instead of sending actual British people up the last bit, they sent Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. They were from New Zealand and Nepal, and they got the job done without encountering any staggeringly beautiful pigs along the way. And that is the end of the story. All right, well, we'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed that story. It was a lot of fun actually learning all about the expeditions to the top of Mount Everest over the years, and the geography and all the politics at the time. It was really, really, really interesting. You sort of think you know about things like that, and then when you actually get into the details of it, it's all fascinating. So anyway, that's the story for this week. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next week. Maybe come back to mythology. I got a whole list of suggestions from the kids at the live show, so we'll see. Oh, I'm thinking of doing Samson and Delilah. I'll have a look into that. Okay, well, that's it for now. Until next time, goodbye. Hello, it's me again. If you enjoyed listening to Bedtime Stories with R.A. Spratt, it would be really helpful if you could like, subscribe, follow, and or review the show on whatever podcast platform you're listening to now. Every little one of those digital affirmations helps, and the bigger this podcast gets, the more I can justify procrastinating from my real job to keep bringing these stories to you. Thank you.